Mr. Smeltzer, what are the key factors contributing to Serbia's historic decline in democracy, as highlighted in this year's Freedom House report on nations in transit, which covers 29 countries?
So in this report, we looked at Serbia's historic decline as being a result of four key institutions of democracy. First being that of electoral process. We saw how their electoral conditions and numerous irregularities in December's snap elections really affected the electoral outcomes and brought into question the legitimacy of the electoral process. So these things included organized voter migration, vote buying, abuse of public resources. We also saw a decline on their independent media rating. And that was due to an increasingly hostile environment for critical journalism, particularly critical of the government, and the unfair and politically driven process allocation of the national broadcasting licenses. And lastly, we saw a decline on the indicator of judicial framework and independence. And that is due to a long-term trend of prosecutorial passivity in addressing what are seen as sort of politically sensitive cases.
The report suggests that Serbia is on the path to becoming a semi-consolidated authoritarian regime. How did Serbia get there? Why do you describe the country that way?
So in this report, Serbia is classified as a hybrid regime. That is a country with a system of governance that has both democratic and autocratic characteristics. It's the largest category of regime that we see in this report. And many regimes, many hybrid regimes like Serbia, have these nominally democratic institutions like elections or independent media outlets, but they're often marred by anti-democratic or even authoritarian practices. And Serbia had moved from our category of semi-consolidated democracies to hybrid regimes about 5 years ago. And since then, this report has only registered declines in Serbia's scores for the institutions we measure. And so if history is to teach us a lesson and if the trajectory is to continue, that moves Serbia closer to this category of semi-consolidated authoritarian regime.
Is such a state of democracy characteristic of any other candidate or member states of the European Union?
So there are a few countries this year that we identify that are following a similar pattern to Serbia, and that is Hungary and Georgia. Hungary being an EU member state, it's going through a similar autocratization process where we see consolidation of power by the ruling elite, specifically Viktor Orban there. In Georgia, we see maybe not the personalization of power around a particular individual, but really these illiberal trends, the use of anti-democratic and even quasi-authoritarian practices to go after the independent media or to go after civil society or to go after specifically vulnerable groups like the LGBT community. And so what we're seeing in Serbia is part of a larger trend in many of these countries that are struggling to really move out of this hybrid regime zone and are headed in the wrong direction.
And there has been a noticeable rise in Euroscepticism in Serbia in recent years, along with continued close ties between Serbian authorities and Russia, which have themselves been criticized in your reports also. Can this be linked to the decline in democracy in Serbia that you have documented?
But what we do see is that Russian involvement in many of these countries in Europe is having an impact on creating, this idea that Europe is the decline of civilization and the decline of democracy. It's really coming from Europe. But in reality, many of the authoritarian regimes are themselves stepping up their attacks and undermining democratic governance across the region. That is a big finding of this year's report, is the way that these authoritarian governments like Russia or China are seeking to undermine democracy elsewhere in places like Serbia and Hungary.
And what are the consequences of such a state of democracy in Serbia, both for the country and its citizens?
We see the impacts of, say, the mass shootings that happened in Serbia with multiple people dead. And that's the real impact of institutions failing to uphold people's rights. Is we see throughout the region of women's rights declining, We see gender-based violence. We see mass shootings. We see all of these violations of basic human rights and civil liberties that filter down from declining institutions. Yeah, in Serbia, I think the thing that gives me hope, the thing that really is making me think that there's potential for democratic renewal in Serbia is the people, right? We've seen how millions have come out to protest against violence and to ask their government to really answer what they're looking for, to make changes that better their lives. And I think that is kind of the key, right? Serbia has a strong civil society. Serbia still has a strong independent media that is calling kind of the powers that be to account.
And do you think that they can make some impact on Serbian authorities at the end? And do you see any willingness Serbian authorities to make some improvements?
The thing about hybrid regimes, of which Serbia is one, is that civil society has less impact, but not no impact, right? This is not an autocracy like Russia, where civilians are being thrown in jail for going out and speaking about issues. They still have a voice, and as long as they're out there raising their voices and their concerns to the government, there's always going to be the hope that there will be change.
I want to ask you also for the reaction of the Serbian government. What do you expect? We know that they criticized your previous report. What kind of response do you expect now?
We hope that they approach these reports with an open mind and clear eyes as to the problems that exist. We are basing this on a specific methodology and have been consistently documenting these declines over time. And so we would ask that they address the problems identified in these reports, not go after personal attacks on specific individuals or Freedom House itself, but really dive into what we've published here.
The report suggests that the Western Balkan region is responsible for many concerning events, and that regional security is often used by political leaders as an excuse to undermine democracy.
Yeah, so the Western Balkans was a big focus of this year's report because so many of the countries experienced declines in their democratic governance. In fact, none of them experienced an improvement in any scores this year. We can think of a country like Bosnia and Herzegovina, where media freedom and local autonomy remain under threat, or North Macedonia, where we saw really major setbacks to the rule of law that gave way to persistent high-level corruption during the year, or even Montenegro, where we had some hopes in recent years but they're still picking up the pieces really from the 2022 constitutional crisis, and that has resulted in kind of dysfunctional governance that has real consequences for people in those countries. And so, we're deeply concerned about what's happening throughout the Western Balkans. We can obviously think of the Russian malign influence in this region that has kind of spread through the media. We can also think about the divisive narratives that are coming from many of the leaders and media outlets that are connected to governments in the region that are pushing this idea that the region is crumbling and that we need help and that we need to protect ourselves. And all of this is creating an environment that is quite toxic to democracy.
And what role does Serbia play in those tensions in the region?
And I think if we look at sort of the media that are aligned with the government in Serbia, they're often pushing these narratives as well. And not only narratives that are beneficial to the ruling party and the ruling regime in Serbia, but also Russian disinformation narratives. I think the foreign policy and the domestic policy and how they relate to democratic development they're very closely aligned. We see this in many countries where often democratic incentives drive the foreign policy of these countries, may make them more aggressive or may make them more isolationist because they recognize it has a benefit for the stability of their own regime at home. And I think that's often the logic of what's happening in Serbia, is that you can see the government making decisions about foreign policy based on what's best for them at home.
And from your perspective, and also considering your report, what is the future of democracy in the countries of the Western Balkan?
Well, the report documents 20 consecutive years of democratic decline, and that's not good news, right? The trend is clearly heading downwards. The Western Balkans really can't go its own way. It has to choose either with the European democratic community or more close alignment with the autocrats of the world.
Mr. Smeltzer, thank you for your time and for speaking to Radio Free Europe.
Thank you.